The tragic murder of 18-year-old Henry Nowak has captured the nation. The 18-year-old boy stabbed in Southampton and then handcuffed as he lay dying. And questions are now being asked about a potential two-tier policing system.
Well, last night there were protests near to where Henry was killed. Police were pelted with bottles and bricks. The Home Secretary condemned what she called the hijacking of the tragedy.
So look, you can see the clashes they're playing out between police and the protesters, forcing officers back from the line they've been holding. They had been organised after the release of police body camera footage on Monday, which showed Henry being handcuffed in the moments before his death.
Let's speak now to both of our correspondents covering this story. Oliver is here, as is Ali, to cover the political angle. Good morning to you both. Ollie, let's start with you. Just update us on what's happened overnight.
Well, we saw at about 5 o'clock yesterday evening outside Southampton Central Police Station, a few hundred protesters had gathered. They were there to listen to speeches by Tommy Robinson, also known as Stephen Yaxley Lennon, and Lawrence Fox. And then a short while afterwards, the protesters broke off and they headed towards the residential area near where Henry Nowak was stabbed to death. And it was at that point that the police were having to really hold their lines. They were wearing riot gear. They kept on getting pushed back and back and back. And we saw quite ugly scenes with bottles being thrown, bricks at one point, wheelie bins thrown towards police officers. Now, so far, we haven't heard of whether any arrests have been made, but we did hear earlier on Tuesday from Hampshire Police saying one of their officers had been misidentified online and had faced death threats and had to relocate for the safety of him and his family. So really what we saw was a sort of fever pitch amongst these protesters as things descended into those quite angry scenes that we saw on the streets of Southampton yesterday. And then separately on this issue of whether there is two-tier policing, which the government denies that there is, we've heard from the National Police Chiefs Council, their chairperson, saying that they're going to be reviewing the guidance in relation that they have. It's called the Race Action Plan. It's the anti-racism guidance that they've got. And they're reviewing to see whether the wording and phrasing of that is fit for purpose so that they can check that everything is equal in the eyes of the law.
Well, we're talking, of course, on the programme about the death of Henry Nowak, stabbed, then handcuffed, as he said that he had been stabbed, as he told police officers that he couldn't breathe. And there are sometimes crimes that happen and things that happen that are so awful that it sparks a desire for a response, a change. And I think this is one of those moments. And look, you've obviously watched the video. I've watched the video. It's something that kind of stays with you. You know, he was treated as a criminal, not a victim, as he was dying, right? The last words he heard were his rights being read out to him. Do you think he was treated in that way because he was an 18-year-old white boy who'd been accused of racism?
I don't know, and we need to get to the bottom of what happened, and the IOPC need to do their investigation, be allowed to do their investigation. There is a large package of body-worn video footage that they will be looking at. There will be conversations and interviews they need to be doing with all of the police who were there, with the family, with everybody to get the proper picture. The police must treat everybody equally under the law. We need to make sure that that happens. I think in the vast majority of cases that does happen. Where it doesn't, you're right, this is one of those moments where the country is saying this feels very wrong, something needs to happen, but we must let the investigation happen to get to the bottom of it and to understand so that we can learn the right lessons.
I was interested you say that the law says that everyone should be treated equally. And I think that's why there's been such a focus on the anti-racism strategy, the 2025 anti-racism strategy from the National Police Chiefs Council. I just want to read it because it is quite important to get a glimpse of what it said. Producing equality of policing outcomes for people from different ethnic groups by responding to individuals and communities according to their specific needs, circumstances and experiences. It does not mean treating everyone the same or being colourblind. Because I guess that feels like it's saying it's OK to not treat everyone equally.
Yeah, and I think it's clumsy, and I think it's right that they're reviewing it.
Is it clumsy or is it wrong? Because, I mean, you can say something clumsily or you can say something that is wrong. And I think some people would say the principle there is wrong.
I think it's right that the MPCC are looking at it.
What's
and
your own view
just to
as
qualify what I think as policing minister, there is a wider piece of work called the Race Action Plan, which was put together under the previous government, which is about how do we train officers, how do we make sure everybody is mindful of the fact that there has been a history of racism in policing that we all know is well documented, and that needs to be addressed. This is quite a small sort of values document, sort of summary, and I think it's not written in the way that it should be, and it's right that it should be reviewed. But I think that shouldn't be taken to mean we need to rip up the whole system.
Yeah.
We don't, but I think this document is wrong.
Nigel Farage says it's a cultural problem, that there is white people are not treated equally. Do you think he's right?
I don't think the evidence at the moment would suggest that. If you look at the facts and figures about policing, I will always listen to the police in terms of what they're saying. And the Home Secretary said yesterday, you know, we need to talk to the police, we need to talk to the Sikh community, we need to talk to knife crime campaigners, we need to understand what it is we need to do differently and better, and we will do that. The message from Henry's family that is so powerful is don't let this, you know, this awful death should lead to something better. And that's what I'm going to be focused on. That's what the Home Secretary is focused on.
You mentioned there about knife crime. Vikram Digworth stabbed Henry 5 times with a 21 centimetres, I think it is, Sikh ceremonial blade. Should it have been legal for him to carry that weapon?
So at the moment, it's 2019 piece of legislation that came in that basically says if you are carrying certain weapon, you have a defence under the law, which is religious. It doesn't name the Kirpan in legislation, but religious purposes, work purposes. You know, if you're going to work and you have to carry a weapon of some kind, then that's a defence under the law. What the Home Secretary said yesterday is that carrying a weapon for religious purposes is one thing, using it is a completely different thing. And the man who murdered Henry Nowak is in prison now for decades, and that is totally right. There is a question, and there will be questions when we know more about him and his history and a number of weapons that were in his home, and we are looking at this more broadly, because it is very disturbing that we are seeing an increase of people who are fixated with violence, who are sort of obsessed with violence and gathering weapons, and we are changing the law to try and tackle that. So the law has just been passed, so if you buy bulk knives, the seller has to tell the police. There are various different pieces of legislation that we're putting in place, but we need to look at these things. And what the Home Secretary said is, let's talk to the Sikh community, let's talk to knife crime campaigners, and let's see what more we can do.
You make the distinction, and I understand it, you know, between carrying a weapon and using a weapon, but you will know in your work with young people and knife crime that even if you're carrying a weapon, as many people think that they're carrying it for defence, if you carry a weapon, you're more likely to use it, right?
You are, yeah.
So
then you're more likely to be hurt yourself, actually.
Exactly. Yeah. So I guess my question again is, should it be legal for someone to carry a 21 centimetre blade?
If it's for work purposes, there might be a reason, and for religious purposes, that is the law as it stands. We need to have conversations about these things always. We're always thinking of new bits of legislation we can do to try and stop people using knife. We've just introduced a new offence of knife possession with intent, which carries a maximum sentence of 7 years. So that's a new piece of legislation we've brought in. But we will keep looking at these things. Knife crime is a scourge in our society. We've committed to halve it in a decade.
Let's speak now to the MP Tan Dhesi, Chair of the Defence Select Committee as well. Very good morning to you. Thanks so much for joining us. Vikram Digworth, who murdered Henry Nowak with a dangerous 8-inch blade, you, like many other senior members of the Sikh community in Southampton and elsewhere, immediately and unrelentingly condemn him, like all murderers.
Well, definitely. I think, Wilf, first of all, I am deeply saddened and shocked by this brutal murder of Henry Nowak. and indeed my heartfelt sympathies and prayers are with the Nowak family. And many of us are aware that this life tragically taken away at such a young age when somebody had so much potential, and the Nowak family's grief was exacerbated by him being wrongly handcuffed by the police, who unfortunately had been taken in by the lies of Vikram Digwa and some of his family members. And that actually stripped from Henry the dignity in his final agonising moments. And that's something that should never be allowed to happen again. But I also want to place on record, Wilf, by yourself, my sincere gratitude and thanks to the Nowak family, in particular Mr. Nowak, for the dignity, the poise, the magnanimity that he showed when he made his statement, because many of us were listening intently to his every single word, because there had been too many people who were looking to divide communities. But how he said he didn't want this murder to lead to division or hatred or tension. And this wasn't about Sikhism, it's not about racism, it's about the murder committed by one violent individual. And that is why I'm extremely grateful on behalf of the Sikh community. Many of my Slough constituents who are Sikh, many of them fear not just shame because it's been committed by somebody of the Sikh community, somebody who's visibly Sikh as well. Mm-hmm. On top of that, they're going through shock, but the fear now for many of them, because of the calls from the likes of Reform, Restore and some of the other parties about banning the kirpan, the ceremonial Sikh dagger, which, by the way, wasn't even used in this brutal murder, but they're now fearful of their ability to freely and peacefully practice their faith. And I want to also say, via yourself, Wilf, that people need to be aware that the murder weapon was actually a pesh kabz, which is an Indo-Persian, highly deadly and dangerous weapon, which was used centuries ago in battles to pierce through body armour. And that's why Henry had no chance of survival, because it leads to significant internal bleeding. And it was used by somebody with an obsession with dangerous weapons. And as Mr. Nowak said, we need to tackle knife crime, something that many of us have been calling on for years.
I mean, here for all your praise of Henry's family and his father in particular. I think everyone agrees they've been unbelievable. As you said, the blade that the murderer of Vikram Digwa used was not a kirpan. It was a big 8-inch dangerous knife. Sikhs can carry a kirpan. Just clarify for our viewers what that is, because there is some confusion between it.
Definitely. Well, look, for well over a century, Sikhs have been residing within Great Britain. Many of my family members, from grandparents to parents, they've been freely practicing their faith. They fought long and hard to get within British law exemptions for the turban, as well as the kirpan. The kirpan, by the way, is only worn by fully baptised Amritdhari Sikhs, those who actually commit to a disciplined way of life, spirituality, not just waking up early in the morning, to have a strong work ethic and much more besides. And that special exemption is there just for those articles of faith. It doesn't give a carte blanche to every single Tom, Dick and Harry out there to be carrying the kirpan. And also, Wilf, you're aware how many instances for well over a century have there been of Sikhs incorrectly or dangerously using a kirpan? Mm-hmm. And also, as I had to point out to the chamber, because I'm fully aware of the pile-on and the attacks on the Sikh community on social media, which has led to a lot of fear within the community, where certain individuals and parties, like I said, Reform, Restore and the far right, actually scapegoating and throwing under the bus an entire community for the actions of one individual. And that's why we need to speak out, because wearing that the turban and the kirpan, mm-hmm. that's what hundreds of thousands of Sikh soldiers who fought bravely alongside British troops during both World Wars, mm-hmm. tens of thousands who made the ultimate sacrifices, wearing those same articles of faith for the freedom of this country. And that's why those people, rather than get into disinformation, mm-hmm. they need to get a history lesson.
I'm pleased to say that joining us now is Yusuf, who's a Reform UK Home Affairs spokesperson. Thank you so much for being with us. Look, I want to talk about Henry. He was handcuffed. He told police officers that he'd been stabbed, that he couldn't breathe. They didn't listen to him at the time. He then died, and his last words were his rights being read out to him. What lessons do you think need to be learned, and what needs to change?
Yeah, it's a tragedy. My heart goes out to Henry's family. But I think, having watched that footage, as distressing as it is, it's hard to escape the conclusion that it is a demonstrable example of structural two-tier policing that is embedded in, for example, Hampshire Police Force and forces across the country. And the reason I say that, people watching this can go to Hampshire Police's website and read their race action plan that was brought about under a Tory government. And you can read what that says, even if it was well-intentioned at the time. What it says, it demands that police officers, Hampshire police officers, must focus their attentions on offences against, quote, ethnic minority communities. And that is why when those officers attended the scene, the accusation of racism from the murderer and his brother was taken on its face with no burden of proof, was immediately taken seriously. And the accusation from poor Henry that he had been stabbed, which any reasonable person would agree is a far greater lethal, immediate potential threat to life, suddenly there was a burden of proof. And, you know, your account there of what happened was accurate and will move people, but you actually left out the fact that one of the things Henry heard having said, "I've been stabbed," was a member of Hampshire Police saying, quote, "I don't think you have, mate." So if we now live in a country where an accusation of racism is so powerful that you can stab somebody repeatedly and have your victim handcuffed by the police, then I think we need to ask ourselves how we arrived in this situation. And we need to be brave enough to call it out and say, everyone must be equal under the law, regardless of your race, regardless of your religion.
You say there that I left those words out. I will repeat those words. I don't want to leave that part of the story out. I just want to be super clear. You know, those were part of the words that Henry heard as he bled to death, right? You know, I acknowledge that, and I want to just talk about how serious the story is and how serious the reaction needs to be to it. Last night in Southampton, people were angry. You know, they took to the streets close to where Henry was stabbed. What's your message to protesters?
Well, look, people in the media have kept asking me why Nigel said that, you know, it was perfectly reasonable and right to be furious about this. And my response is, if you have watched that footage, there are many, many emotions that come about, one of which I think has to be anger. Now, the question is how you channel that anger. The way to channel that anger is to do what we can to bring about political change. You know, that's why we've already announced a policy that we would bring about in the first 100 days of a reform government. If Nigel's our Prime Minister and I'm our Home Secretary, then we will bring about the Equal Treatment Act that will abolish and ban things like those race action plans and remove the DEI programs from our police forces that, as I say, demonstrably create racism against white people so that everyone is treated equally under the law. And in terms of people protesting, look, I understand why people are angry. And as I said, it is important, whether you're at those protests or not, if you agree with what we're saying and believe that we should have a country and a police force and a justice system that treats everybody equally, then we should do everything we can to bring about the political change that's necessary.
You've spoken a bit about treating everyone equally, and I just wanted to touch on an attack ad that was put out by Reform about Kemi Badenoch. Before looking at the advert, I just want to read what Kemi Badenoch said. She said, "I don't want to hear about Black Lives Matter. I don't want to hear about White Lives Matter. We all matter. Enough of this nonsense where we keep separating everybody." And then I'm just going to show you the attack ad that was put out by Reform. So you can see there, contrasting what she said in 2020, the bottom quote, "I don't want to hear about White Lives Matter." Do you accept that that is a misrepresentation of what she said, given just immediately before that quote, she said, "I don't want to hear about Black Lives Matter"?
No, I don't. No, I don't. Because everything in that ad are accurate words that she said. So then the next question is, to call it misrepresentative, then it would need to meet the standard that the things, that the message being communicated by those words, those truncated sentences, communicated something different to what she said at the time. And if you look at the context of 2020,
just to
after
comment,
Black Lives Matter,
she literally said, I don't want to hear about Black Lives Matter, I don't want to hear about White Lives Matter.
Important point. Post Black Lives Matter, Kemi equivocated in the sense that she said, did not equivocate, meaning she was willing to say Black lives do matter. Post Henry Nowak's murder, she said, quote, she did not want to hear about White Lives Matter, nor about Black Lives Matter. Therefore, the point of the ad is that in one instance, Kemi Badenoch did not equivocate, and in the other, she did.
Okay,
and the
just to
primary difference
come in,
being the ethnicity of the victim, and therefore the ad is accurate, and we stand by it.
If I may, sorry, I know it's hard, you know, when we're not in the same room, but just to come in, if I may, what you say there is not what the attack ad says. You say there that she equivocates and she says two things in 2026, right, which I accept. That is not what that attack ad says. That attack ad misses out the words that you could have decided to put in there. That's my argument for why it feels like it is misrepresenting what she said.
Well, you can make that argument, but the point I'm making is that the only way you could argue that the attack was misrepresentative is if it fundamentally changed the meaning of the two different things that she said. And we were drawing a contrast between the equivocation that existed in one instance and the fact that she did not equivocate in the other. Therefore, the meaning is clear. We stand by it.
Can I just say, about an hour later after that attack ad, you, in response to a Telegraph headline saying that Nigel Farage said White Lives Matter, you put out this tweet, disgusting from the Telegraph. Nigel Farage said that white lives matter just as much as black lives. To shorten a sentence like that is journalistic malpractice and deliberately misleading. I mean, it sounds like it's exactly the same thing that you guys did.
No, it isn't, because again, what the Telegraph were not drawing a distinction and contrasting two statements made by the same person in response to two different instances. Again, with respect, you've got to let me finish my answer, because you just made a pretty serious allegation against me. So please let me respond. What the ad that Reform Party put out with regards to Kemi Badenoch's response to the George Floyd killing and Henry Nowak's murder were that in one instance she equivocated, in the other instance she did not. What the Telegraph were not doing were drawing a distinction between Nigel Farage's response to those incidents. They simply left out the latter half of the sentence. And by the way, the BBC this morning, you can go and see, last night on Newsnight, Matt Chorley went out and claimed on three separate occasions, put to Kemi Badenoch the notion that Nigel Farage had called for people to respond to Henry Nowak's murder with, quote, cold white rage. Now, with white cold rage, the insertion of the word white, entirely fictional, right? So we have been on the receiving end of this relentlessly. But I want to reiterate, we stand by what we put in that ad because the meaning is crystal clear. Kemi's words after George Floyd, she was willing to say that black lives do matter. And post Henry Nowak's murder, she is unwilling to say that white lives matter. That is the point that we're making, and that is a perfectly valid point to make.
I guess the point that I want to make is I feel that you have articulated an anger that a lot of people feel right now, right? You know, over the death of this 18-year-old boy. People feel very viscerally. And you have received attacks from others that you were inflaming a situation and you're trying a political point score. This particular ad, you can see how it plays into the hands of people who are saying that of you by deliberately truncating what she said.
Well, there are bad faith actors who make accusations against us all of the time. And we're going to continue to say things that we believe to be true because we're not afraid of those attacks. And look, we should also put everything into context. What happened when Keir Starmer went onto the media? He somehow found himself attacking Nigel Farage, talking about the Henry Nowak murder body cam footage. Kemi Badenoch went out attacking Nigel Farage.
You're talking a lot about what other people are saying about you, and I guess I'm trying to say that quotes. I'm just trying to put it back to what you're saying about other people. The point being is that if you're putting to me that we're getting Reform UK is getting attacked, that's just any given day. We're used to that. But the point here is that we need to be crystal clear that the Henry Nowak murder was an example, an egregious example, a horrific example of structural anti-white racism and two-tier policing in this country. And we're going to keep making those points. And one of the reasons why it is perfectly legitimate to draw a contrast between, for example, Kemi Badenoch's reaction to the George Floyd killing and Henry Nowak's murder is precisely because, as I said, the
DEI programs that have damaged this country so much in terms of our institutions were injected directly into the veins of our institutions by Tory governments over 14 years, including ones of which Kemi Badenoch was a part. And to be unwilling to, they haven't apologised for that. The Hampshire Race Action Plan was put into place under a Tory government. These are the sorts of things that need to be abolished immediately. So again, we have one law for everybody in this country.
Yusuf, thank you very much. Good to have you on the programme.